The talk started now. Just want to say it's going to be super informal. So you feel free to unmute yourself anytime if you got questions. Yeah, and so let me go ahead and get it started. So my talk this month is called Developing Airtable, which is a NPM package open source project I've been working on over the past few months. It's written in TypeScript, and was it's to kind of Airtable has a client that they provide, that's their officially supported one, but I've been doing a lot of kind of like application work trying to use Airtable as a backend, and I it just had some things that I needed that and some I kept using these same patterns over and over that were pretty clunky, and so I decided to put them together into a library and release them to the public. So a little about me. My name is James Pierce. I'm a web developer, and I am a principal here at Super Basic. We're a two-person shop. Uh, Chris Reed and I run it together. And I've been professionally working with the web for just a little over 8 years. And I've been doing it, I've been involved with web development and building websites since the mid 90s, since I was a little kid. So it's been kind of a lifelong journey and interest of mine. Um, I'm a full stack developer. I work with um, I work on the back end and the front end and DevOps and product management and kind of the whole deal. But I've spent I've invested most of I've invested the most time in my JavaScript and front end knowledge, and uh, yeah, but I do also do work with Ruby and Python and PHP when I'm in a pinch. And my little soapbox note here, HTML and CSS should get more respect than they do. There's a lot deeper than I think a lot of people, I think a lot of developers kind of think of that like, oh, I learned HTML and oh, I learned CSS. And then, um, a couple years, I know that for me down the road, I'd be like a couple years in, I was like, why do I hate working with CSS so much? This is horrible. Um, and it's because I didn't know it as well as I could. And then, okay, I'll get off my soapbox. All right, so just brief introduction. If we don't know what Airtable is, I want to just get everyone basically on the same page. It's basically kind of like a relational database provider. It's like that it presents itself as like a Google Sheets, but way souped up. There's a lot of additional functionality and flexibility and a really nice interface. Um, and it provides access to all of this data with it's a pretty easy to use API for basic use. So it's very attractive. This combination is really attractive for building out kind of prototype software. It gives you a low code way to get a nice interface to all of your data. You just design the data model and have all the tables accessible via this really nice front end that they provide, and you can organize and filter and view all your data in lots of different ways, so you can get insights from your data without having to know SQL. So it's a nice thing to have if you have a less tech savvy client who you want them to be able to see what's actually going into their application. And the REST API is like has some auto generated documentation, and it'll get you, that documentation will get you part of the way there. So brings us to what is Airtabler, and I mentioned this a little bit. It's an open source client for the Airtable API. It's written in TypeScript. That's an implementation detail, but it's important to the like stability of the project, and it's let me do more as just one person, one or two people, and Airtabler is designed to provide abstractions for common patterns that I was used to with tools like Active Record, which is Rails ORM, or Prisma, which is a Node.js ORM. And I suppose I should define ORM. An ORM is an object relational mapping thing. What it does is takes your data and the schema of your relational database and presents it and gives you, like, automatically generates the like methods and things that let you traverse your data in a way, and programmatically in a way that just like maps really well to how our brains think about it. So it makes working with data a lot easier than writing, say, like a raw SQL query. So I say this is an ORM-like piece of software because um, it doesn't have the piece where it sees the schema of the data and generates all the stuff for you. You kind of have to know your schema, but it does simplify a lot of the patterns and gets us a lot closer to that kind of ORM-like experience. So why is Airtabler? I got into this a little bit, but because I like Airtable as a data store for prototype applications. We've built several of these smaller applications. When you're just needing to get up and running quick, it's a great backend. It does have limitations to where you'll have to, if you get any kind of traction, you'll have to move off of it pretty quickly. But the kind of traction that you'd get if you got that, it would be a good thing that you were moving off of it quickly. I missed Active Record as someone who works a lot with Rails on the back end. Just having that really easy, really kind of like natural way of expressing relationships of data in code was something that I was lacking in my interactions with the Airtable, with their official client and with their API. And yeah, so that brings us into the official client just wasn't doing the stuff that it wasn't providing me the handles for like common data tasks that you would have if you're trying to use this thing as the backend for an application. And it seemed, it technically gives you all the access and all the control, but it makes some things that shouldn't be hard, and some things that should well, I don't know about shouldn't be easy, but it wasn't focused on the right things for my use case. And other parts of it, like, to do the things that I wanted to do, I had to get past the documentation that they provided. It only covers some of the use cases, and then when you get into more advanced use cases, I really was digging around in Airtable's community forums to find solutions, and just things that weren't well documented. And so I did all that work to figure out how to do some of these things, and I thought that it would be nice to be able to share it. And it also the last note is just that it's not receiving a whole lot of attention from the Airtable team. It's maybe they've done maybe 1 or 2 releases in the past year, and most of those were like just bumping the versions of dependencies. And I think they added one little optional attribute to their options object. So there's not a lot going on with it. It is what it is. It doesn't look like it's going to change. I think their focus is elsewhere. So I saw it as a good opportunity to kind of jump in and get things closer to what I would have liked to have seen. So an example here, this is with the official library. To get all of, say I have a dogs table in Airtable and I just want to get all of the records. I have to write this kind of, this is a query that you say Airtable, you tell it which base or table, you call this select function, and then you have to call this each page function and give it a callback that tells it to fetch the next page. It's all, and like pulling data actually out of this callback is tricky. So you have to do the dreaded kind of like initializing an array outside of it and push the data to that array outside. It's just a little nasty. It's hard to understand. So I wanted to abstract this away, and so I didn't have to think about all this stuff because I was doing this for like being able to pull all the records from a table is like table stakes for an ORM. So with Airtabler, we're able to, here's our like initialization statement. I've hidden some of the config, but it's just a 2-key JavaScript object, and then I instantiate this object we call a model called dogs. So we have this dogs model, and then when I want all the dogs, I just call dogs.all, and it goes through all the pagination, does all that stuff. It pulls all these records and just spits them out to my all dogs variable. So I don't have to worry about all these callbacks. I don't have to do all that stuff. It's just it. And this is a similar pattern to how you would do it with Prisma or how you would do it with Active Record. So get into something a little more complex, which is when you start getting into the relationships between 2 different tables. Say I have in this instance, I have a party record that I want to pull, but what I'm really interested in is the dogs at that party. So the Airtable, you can link a row in the table to other records in different tables. But what the API gives you is it returns as a field. So I have this dogs field, which is the relationship, and it returns an array of these IDs. And there's no simple way to query the API just for records with only these IDs. So if you did it in a naive way, you would just like to figure out which dogs were there, you'd have to pull all the dogs and then find which ones had IDs that matched this array. Or not documented at all in the documentation is you can use this filter by formula key on the and pass it as an option to this select method. And there you can send it an Airtable formula that if it returns true, then it will pull this record. So, the only dogs I'm interested in pulling really, because I don't want to go through and filter them all out again, I want my backend to do it, is the dogs in this party. So to get them, I have to do this weird formula where I search, I use this search and then record ID, and then you pass the array joined, the array of IDs joined. And what this does is it goes through each, on the Airtable backend, it goes through each of the records in the table, says, hey, what's the record ID of this row? And then, is that record ID, can I find that in this string? And if that's true, then it returns that that record. This is a hairy thing to have. This is a really common task that you need to do. To the reason we have relationships in our data is because we want to use them and we want to be able to understand them. So this is a pretty common thing, and this is a really nasty way to have to do. This is error prone. There's a lot of boilerplate just to do a kind of like run of the mill query to your database. So what I've done with Airtabler is abstracted all of that out. And this kind of illustrates the ORM like qualities of it, which is that so I pull the party, so DB model party, find by the ID, and then I use the dogs model, and I use this where method, and then I can just pass it an array of IDs, and it knows to generate that whole query and send that to the Airtable API. And I don't have to remember all that stuff, and I don't have to debug typos and that stuff, and I don't have to read 10 lines of code when I'm really just doing something very basic and simple that I expect to be able to do easily. Why I call this ORM like is that if this was a true ORM, what you would be able to do is, like, this would be, instead of having to pull the party separately, I could just pull the party, and then it would be able to infer the relationships from the data that was on them. And that requires visibility into the schema of the data, which Airtable doesn't give us access to. At least not by default. They have a metadata API that you can access if you have an enterprise account, or I've sent the request multiple times to Airtable. You can request access to it, but they say that they're not really giving out these tokens anymore. But you can request it. I've requested it multiple times over several months and haven't heard back. So we're moving along, assuming that we don't have that access, and so we can only partially implement these ORM things. But anyway, I think it's clear here the difference in effort and the reduced likelihood for screw ups and the ease of readability here compared to this code here. This is pretty hard to parse. If you were new to this code base, you would look at that and be like, all right, and you'd have to go through, learn, and this would take half an hour to figure out what actually was happening here if you were coming from zero. Whereas this, I think, um, it's a much quicker on the read. It's much quicker to pick up. There's less opportunity for things to go wrong, and yeah, you can kind of query your data in a much more natural way. And it took a while, so that's kind of the intro to some of the abstractions that we've done with this project. And this quote here is kind of what my kind of metric for like when to abstract stuff. It's a really great quote from a great talk by Sandy Metz, who you may or may not be familiar with, but duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction, which this kind of goes, this is the counterpoint to a lot of early stuff you learn when you're learning development and software engineering, which is the dry principle, the don't repeat yourself principle. But the cost of like prematurely abstracting something out into a method is that what tends to happen is that you don't fully understand the problem that you're trying to solve with the abstraction. So you end up creating the wrong one, and then you end up with a as new cases come along that are trying to use this abstraction, but realize that the abstraction is not quite right. A lot of times, what happens is we get like a big list of conditionals inside of a method, and um, when you start to get into that, then when you have multiple if thens, like 20, you exponentially grow the possible states and return values of each method. And, as those methods grow exponentially, the difficulty of debugging and adding new features and understanding what you're actually working on grows. So what I'm saying here is that I spent a long time not building this Airtabler library and just working with the Airtable API and just with the Airtable.js, their officially supported client, before making this move, and really got familiar with some of the challenges that I was frequently running against before we started working on this project. So I'm going to open it up to questions now. Anybody want to ask me anything about TypeScript? This is also my first open source project. Anyone interested in open source work, or like what that's like, or interested in contributing anything, I'll open it up.
Yeah, so I actually did have a question. So in Airtable, is it pretty difficult to perform like joins then, I take it then and stuff? Because basically what you just kind of demonstrated was like doing like an is in, right? Basically in SQL, right? Where you pull the party in, you get the dogs, and then you check if those dogs are in that other table, right? But if I wanted to like actually perform a join between two tables, is that pretty challenging to do in Airtable?
Well, it in the interface itself, you can do that, but like when you're trying to do it through it, the challenge comes when you're trying to access the data outside of Airtable itself, because their
I
actual
see. I
front
see.
end interface can do all kinds of fancy stuff, but the API doesn't can't really see a lot of that stuff, and um,
So effectively, you end up doing joins manually, right?
Yeah,
yeah,
that's I guess the question. Okay. Yeah.
And so like,
Yeah.
but like a join would potentially be something that you could build into a tool like Airtabler, right?
Right.
In the sense of like you're going to be repeating this pattern over and over again, as so like why not have it built into your ORM like um, uh, uh, library, right? So
Right.
like,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
and I suppose there's sort of a question of like, you know, right now you don't really have a join function, right, James? So it's
Right.
like that would be like one sort of, feature to build out. Are there any other sort of features in your mind that are, like would be next in the queue, so to speak?
Um. So I think so. This one isn't uh, quite. I would say so. Obviously, so joins, unions, right? But I mean, union you can. It's a little easier to do, right? The manual implementation of, but the uh, the other thing is obviously like group by, right? Is another really common operation that you might do, right?
Hmm.
Or something like that, where okay, I don't know, let's say I have all these sales numbers or something, and I need to, quickly figure out what was the, total sales for this particular category, right, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's another common thing you end up doing a lot in SQL, right?
Well, and also like sorting, though I suppose sorting, scoping, um,
Yeah, that's
I'm
true
thinking
too.
more along the
That's
lines of like the just mimicking active record style, you know, typical
yeah.
Yeah. Like,
operations.
so sorting is something that's available through the API, and so that'll be up
Mm.
in pretty short order. That's the like group by. So one way you can do that, um, not with Airtabler yet, but is there. Airtable has this feature called views, which lets you open up a table in Airtable and you can say like, hey, I want to group all this stuff by the email address, and it'll create another. You can create another view of your data that shows it grouped by, and the views are accessible via the API, but you can't,
Mhm.
as far as I understand, you can't create a view with the API. So like,
Okay. Yeah.
so you couldn't. There's a little bit of the two-wayness of this. There's a lot of like only one-way stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that is in Airtable that isn't exposed via the API. And so those are the things we're still kind of like learning what the boundaries of what we can do
Sure. No,
are.
that makes sense. Definitely. Yeah. It's just yeah, it's really interesting to see kind of like just how much code is required, right, to do a simple like is in basically, right? Just in the
Yeah,
in the yeah in the base. It's interesting. It
yeah,
also is kind of like I mean the other thing that's interesting, right, is obviously performing that string like basically because you get all the dog names and you perform that join, right? So it just becomes one large string, right? And you're basically just checking if it's in there, basically instead of like actually doing is in SQL, right? You would basically say, okay, this column in, and then like an actual like list, right?
yeah,
Basically, it'd
yeah,
be like which is interesting, yeah. So it
yeah.
is instead of yeah,
Using the record ID is a pretty
yeah.
safe way of doing it.
Hmm.
I'm not sure. What I'm not sure with it, and what I haven't learned
Yeah.
yet, is like what is the like maximum practical number of records you could query for at once with that, right?
Yeah, I was actually that was something I was curious about too. Like, what is the kind of limit? Yeah, that you can actually like hit it for, right, to try to bring
Like
it back.
if
Yeah.
you are setting up this string that is, see, each one is like 12 characters or something. So 12, if you get 12,000, like how would the Airtable API handle that filter on every single record? Can it do that efficiently? I'm not sure. And
Yeah.
that's part of, like, as I've dug deeper, like, I'm trying to position this as something that is for smaller type of projects. But I am very curious what the kind of like upper boundaries are on some of these solutions, because they seem, yeah, a little dodgy. Or like,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I was kind of when you were talking, you also kind of mentioned about the whole experience of like making this open source and whatnot. So what was kind of the uh, one thing I'm honestly don't have a great level of expertise in is like how all the different licensing works and how you kind of make that decision when you choose to open source something.
yeah.
Is it just kind of I was kind of curious how that sort of went down for this. Was it kind of you could just inherit what they had and then
Well, I'm not dependent on any of their code. So
Oh, I see. Okay, so you don't. I wasn't sure how much if you had used any of. So you wrote the whole thing then in
yeah,
yourself. Okay,
it's all,
I see.
I'm building Axios requests, and um, yeah,
Oh, okay,
I'm
gotcha.
building the requests to the API from scratch. I'm not using their. It's not like a
Oh,
layer on top of a layer. I didn't want
I see.
that.
Okay, so you could just release it then, however you want to license it then
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah,
I see.
and that is like one of the questions you have. That's one of the first things you have to like. It's like, oh, I didn't really ever think about what license do I want on this. I just went with
Right.
ISC, which is basically MIT. It's just super
Yeah.
permissive and just says like, it's not my fault if this thing destroys your stuff.
Yeah.
That's sort of the primary thing it
That's
says.
the
It's
most
not my
important
fault.
part. Like, I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
care what you
Yeah.
do with
Yeah.
it, just don't sue me.
You can't sue me, is what it says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
can't.
You know. I mean, you could try, but like it's no warranty.
Uh,
No, no, definitely.
but yeah, those are question, like the licensing question is a really interesting one, I think. And
Yeah.
I bumped into it also. I was looking. There's a lot of like open source hardware stuff, and which is a newer thing, and like a is kind of, I think, going through the same exact concerns that software open source software did when it's, which is like, what if someone like takes my code that's open source and like builds a commercial product with it, like, um and it's like, but that's the point, right? Like,
Yeah,
I'm
like
trying to,
like
like,
some of the stuff is like one example that like is a little hard to I have a hard time understanding this, right? And I've tried to read up on this quite a bit, but there's like that one license, what is it, LGPL, right? And
Yeah.
what's really confusing with like that particular license or the GPL license family, right, is you technically have to make the source code available, right?
Right.
And it's kind of confusing like if you tried to like build a quote unquote commercial product, right, and you use that code, it's like how do you like you sandbox off
you
just that portion so you can
can't,
see it, or you
you,
can't, right,
you can't,
basically, right?
it's like,
It depends
Yeah,
on it depends on which LGPL because there are different
there's
versions.
different ones,
well,
right? Yeah.
And
The Rails community just got hit with this like last year, which was it was using Rails itself was using a library called Mime Magic that was released with this license, and
Okay.
the guy, they basically had
called it in.
just like pulled it. He was like, "Hey, y'all can't use this," like, and so they had it broke so much stuff across just the whole Rails ecosystem, because we had to
Right.
pull that dependency and find a replacement and get it in there. Um,
Yeah, it's
so
definitely crazy. Yeah, how that
it,
can it's easy to like get away, just like oh crap, I forgot to look at the license. I mean, it's not that that's an excuse, but it literally can happen, right? Because you just
well,
install something, and next thing you know, like
yeah, and everything that you build on top of if you're building on a framework, you're pulling in thousands of dependencies. I'm like, if one of them has the wrong license, then it kind of like cascades throughout the whole thing.
Right.
So to avoid any silliness, because I don't care about that stuff. I'm not trying to protect this or like
Yeah.
claim as just like, yeah, ISC, do what you want. I don't,
Yeah.
There's an interesting side part of this is there's a movement that I was reading about called like ethical open source, and there are these open source licenses that people are trying to figure out how to articulate and how to put into their projects that say like, yes, this is a very permissive license, but you can't use this to say like, you know, build a bomb, right? Um, like set some limit on it, like on the use of the software to keep it
Mhm.
from
That's
being
interesting.
used for things that you perceive to be unethical. Which, I mean, building bombs pretty ethical.
Complicated.
Don't there, but
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
like facial recognition stuff, things like that, gets where we have real deep ethical questions about the use of this stuff. But I didn't go down that. If someone uses this for something unethical, I don't know what I'd do. I don't know what do you do?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like, I mean, the
I
people
can't.
that are doing those type of things are operating under the, you know what I mean?
It's really. It gets into a weird. It's kind of like a double bind, trying to like enforce ethics but also be open, and it's an interesting
Right.
question that I feel like needs to be grappled with more.
Well, I think it's relevant in some ways to like our previous talk, like the last one with Jeff, where he was talking about how, they have this open source library, and then they have this recurring problem of people packaging up their library and just like dropping ads on it, and then spamming the app store and getting in front of them so that, that gets seen instead of what they've done. And then there's like reliability issues and, things that come up like that. So, I mean, there is sort of like would the license change that? Probably not, but it would at least give you arguably like a quicker sort of like, here's what they're doing wrong when you're appealing to the app store or whatever. So I think it makes sense, and I think this is something that will evolve a bit. I don't think this particular project is so liable to it, though.
Mhm.
There are lots of other services out there for like automating how you integrate Airtable, and that's basically like what the like wraparound project would be with something like this, most likely.
Well, like
And it,
there's this do no harm license, which says like, hey, you can't use this if you're abusing human rights or destroying the environment or using it for war or to build gambling stuff. Like, um, but
right.
yeah, it's two conflicting kind of impulses, right? The
Yeah.
freedom of your software and then like, but trying to set some
Well,
constraints on it. And
while we're on the like community engagement angle of this, I suppose, while you've been talking on this, I set up the GitHub pages for the project. It looks like the pages hadn't been regenerated in a while, so I went ahead and did a PR for that. Um, the and there's probably I've been looking at like how to get the pages to auto update on merge to master or whatever.
yeah, there's a couple things that
there,
need to happen.
I'll leave that to you. I'll leave that to you on that part of it. But
if you open that as an issue or something, it might be helpful.
Yeah. And I think just also on I think more immediately on in terms of contributors, like I don't in the README we don't have like how to run the test suite currently. Is it in the package JSON
It's
probably?
in there. It's in, isn't it in contributing? Yeah, it's in the contributing thing. So
Got it, got it, got it.
scroll
So
down.
look at the contributing. Yeah, yeah, and there it is. Boom, cool.
Um,
Um,
but yeah, all that. There's so many things to tie up, and if we start getting more people involved, then it'll need to be even more buttoned up. But
I think it's sort of both sides of it where it's like, chicken and egg, right? Like, where's the open door? And I think, it's like if we create a few issues with some of the next things you want to work on, right? That's like that gives people a starting point.
yeah,
Um, like there's that site that's like good first issues or something like that. Have you seen that?
yeah, I've had a lot of trouble. Like, I've always wanted to do open source stuff, but like trying to figure out how to crack into it, like contribute to a project is like just getting spun up on one is hard enough. And then, a lot of these maintainers are like overworked already. So they're like, it's like, are they even gonna read are they gonna look at my PR? Are they like, um,
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
it's
especially on some of these bigger ones.
Hey
Yeah,
guys, just real quick. I sorry, Emily, I just saw your chat.
I was about to
So
say yeah that she has some question.
she can't unmute, so I'm gonna try to unmute you. Let's see.
Actually, I can. I just changed. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, there we go.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I just have a question about TypeScript, but it's okay if you guys you don't have time. I just want to know more about like how TypeScript kind of jumps in this DB calling thing.
So let's see if I can basically what how I've implemented it. Let's see if I can. I'll just. I'm forgetting my keyboard shortcuts right now. But let's see. Can y'all still hear me? Yeah, you can.
Can hear you, but I think your screen dropped.
I dropped my screen.
Yeah. Back now.
So, the kind of rubber hits the road with TypeScript, and like and forgive me if I'm going too far back. I don't know everyone's background with TypeScript, but you generate this types document, and you can pull. And what this does is it lets you do something that I've like wanted in JavaScript for a long time, which is to define the shape of the objects that you're passing around, and ensure that whatever you're doing, you're like actually passing that shape around. So like if I need the Airtabler config object, I can specify in whatever method call that I'm using that type, and I have it defined up here, and then I can like guarantee that whenever I'm accessing this object in the rest of the code, that I have access to base ID and API key. And what that does, like the confidence that gives me, and it's not just like mental confidence, like the code actually forces you to pass those objects around in the correct shape. It lets you know that it eliminates, I'm going to use a phrase I've heard a bunch, but it eliminates a whole class of errors in JavaScript development. And the main one, the one that I just like never want to see again in my life is the null type error, which is I don't.
Yeah, I still cannot see your screen, but I'm
Oh,
wondering if you mind sharing the GitHub link, so I guess I can
yeah,
go and
yeah,
see,
uh-huh,
yeah, like how you work
for
together.
sure.
Thanks a lot.
Let's see, dropping it in the Lunch and Learn chat. Um,
Thank you.
have you done any TypeScript stuff?
Just a little bit for so we usually just using our UI, so we just make sure that when we return the object, the types match. So that's why I'm
Hmm.
curious about how you use this in a database code. I never put these two things together. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's just like as it's just like I don't know if any of it is super specific to any of the stuff I'm doing is super specific to like how the database works. But what's been interesting is that I can use it to kind of make sure that I'm doing things cleanly or like I don't know. Have you ever heard of this thing called railway coding? I'm getting off in the weeds right now, but um, railway-oriented programming. This guy has a really interesting talk about it, but basically the way that it works is what I'm trying to get closer to is that your methods and your functions can either return the correct data or they can return an error. And what that does is changes the whole flow of the program. But the whole way you only have just like two paths that your code can go on, which is either everything's going correctly or something's going wrong, and you don't have uh, code that's branching off into like hundreds, thousands of different possible states, but instead you kind of are able to always know you're either in this state or in this one. Is the really inarticulate way of trying to describe what railway-oriented programming is. I would, if you, um,
Well,
anyway,
part of
well,
it's partly about like having a reasonable way of handling errors at different points in the control flow, so that things can move down the happy path or get on to the like we have a failure somewhere in here. And so part of the idea is like moving to success and failure rather than just like error state. At least that's one of the things I
yeah.
took from that talk.
Um,
Um,
but the types, they let me like, it's been interesting working with an external API that I don't have control over because I can use the types um, to kind of to understand what the response from the API is uh, without having to do any like weird checks for properties or like any kind of like does this thing have is this an object with an error key on it? Then do this. It's like no, is this thing the shape of the error? And and that's cool for a couple of reasons to me. It just saves me from putting in a whole bunch of weird conditionals to check for error states in the code. And then B, it, um, oh, I just lost my train of thought. It, it lets me, it will let, it lets me understand if the API did for some reason change which it shouldn't, being that it's an API, but it's not managed by me, so it could. It'll let me know exactly how it's changed and what part, like how the shape of the data has changed, and like what, and I won't have to go digging through all the responses to find that. My tests will tell me that, and the program itself, when I'm building it, will tell me. Um, so, down the line, what it does by just like a little investment up front in this kind of like boilerplatey TypeScript stuff is like saves me a lot of pain down the line. And I think it's really important for a project like this where it's interacting with an API that I don't have control over, but it's also potentially someone could be using it to do like critical work for their application, and I need to be able to respond quickly and correctly to changes that come down that are out of my control. So it just gives me some nice safety and some nice like built-in tooling to understand that and to guarantee that the shape of the data is what we expect it to be. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, no, I think I'm following you on that. It makes sense to me.
Okay, and
Emily had to drop. It looks
Emily
like.
had to drop.
Yeah.
Well, I got a pretty good ramble in. We got any other questions? Anything you want to ask?
I think I'm pretty good. I did have, I guess, one other thing I was kind of thinking about because you mentioned it right at the beginning of your talk here. When you said you kind of went a few years like thinking you were fine on CSS, and then you sort of had this realization that you didn't actually know it, right? You
Yeah.
kind of mentioned. Yeah, I completely understand what you mean by that. I think I think there's a lot of people that like I don't know, they get to a point where they can I don't know, they have they understand all the fundamentals, right? I feel like that's where I'm at with it,
Yeah.
but then as you start trying to do more and more complex things in it, I feel like I don't even know it at all. You know what I mean? Like everything is just like it's like a coincidence, right? That what I have ended up like doing what I wanted it to do. That's how it feels. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but like, yeah, it just feels like I'm just always like piling all these cards, building this house of cards, right? And then there's like, I don't know, I messed up one selector somewhere or something in that long file, right? And then I don't
Yeah.
know.
I
It's
know I felt just tons of pain from working with CSS and working with legacy
yeah,
CSS. And by legacy, I mean
yeah,
stuff that I've inherited from other people and stuff that I've inherited from myself.
yeah, for sure.
And, uh,
Yeah,
I think that a lot of that, I mean, I'll partly blame a little bit the design of CSS. I'm not going to give it 100% of a pass. But it,
yeah,
as I've spent the time and like found people that did really spend the time to know it and understand it in a deep way, um,
yeah,
I realized that it was possible and it was within reach
right.
to
What?
make something that wasn't a total hellscape. I,
Sure. I mean,
yeah,
do you think what separates the people that kind of get there, are the people that just devote the time and the docs and stuff like that? You think, or what do you think it is that helps you get there? Because it doesn't feel like the learning path to mastering CSS is the same as like mastering like say JavaScript, right? Or like
yeah.
like Python or something. Like
Um,
it's just not. Yeah. Like
well, I'm gonna be this guy. But the person who the stuff that got me across the line really uh, the was the Tailwind project. So I'm gonna be
I
that guy.
see. Okay.
But like specifically,
Yeah.
not just like, oh, Tailwind is a magic bullet, but like actually like reading
Yeah.
what the people who are working on Tailwind were writing and listening to what they're like, the thought that they were putting into all the decisions they made in regards to
Right.
the project. Like like gave me a ton of more like a realization that I wasn't approaching it with enough respect, and then B, that I was like doing it in a silly way. And um, if you haven't read this article, let's see.
No, fair enough. I appreciate the advice because, like I said, I feel like that's one area that I'm like, I've been having issues like trying to improve in, So
Yeah, I'll give you
yeah, like
my like the one that got me across the line. This is a pretty. I can't. There's no way I'd be able to be as articulate as Adam Watson is here on it, but uh, the utility first stuff. Once once I got there, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. No more crazy. No, I had been going down this path of like, let's figure out what kind of like insane stuff can I do with fancy CSS selectors and like, what is it? There's like the drunk owl or something. There's some. Anyway, there's all kinds of stupid stuff
no,
that
no,
you
no,
can
no, fair
do.
enough. No, I appreciate the link. I'll definitely give that a read. Like I said, it's just yeah. I'm trying to get to a point where it doesn't feel like a coincidence that the CSS I had worked. You know what I mean? That's what I'm
Yeah,
trying to get to. Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like,
totally.
yeah,
You'll
yeah.
get
Stop
there.
feeling like you
It's
just fell into it and feel like you have like a framework to understand it, right? Instead of just yeah.
yeah, it's kind of the like, do I rush in and it kind of goes back to the Sandy Metz quote that duplication is better than premature abstraction. And I think
Yeah.
CSS really, really like looks like it. It steers you towards premature abstraction. Really, it like says like, hey, here it is, just abstract it out. Like, make a button class. And then you're like, but I actually need a button that's slightly different here, and then you end up with all these like weird conditionals. It's the same. It's the same problem.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Exactly. That's actually another thing I'll mention. I thought was kind of interesting. Have you heard of IMBA before? IMBA.
IMVA. No, I've
Yeah.
not.
IMBA. Yeah. It's like it's been in development for some time, but it's a new attempt to like remove having to do HTML, CSS, and JS, and you just use one language for everything.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah,
Okay. Bold.
yeah.
Can you throw a link to that?
I, some of the you should look at some of the man. I've been amazed at like some of the toy problems that they kind of show, like implementations, like just like how little code it actually requires to achieve some of this stuff is like pretty pretty remarkable. But
Yeah, that's
especially some of the like user interaction stuff with like I don't know that they have like a demo of like a drawing pad and stuff. I was like, holy crap! Like, yeah, pretty
interesting.
cool.
Um, but
Anyway, yeah,
same thing with HTML. I think the same. Like, I keep learning new stuff about it, and I've been literally doing it since I was 8 years old. So,
yeah. No, I mean, I feel like until like you actually spend a lot of time with it, it's hard to understand that like it's not. I think there's a lot of people who think like yeah, I mastered it in a week or something. And it's like yeah,
I mean,
yeah, maybe you could
you
yeah,
can get there.
yeah, maybe you could make some boxes or something. But
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, sorry that kind of off topic. I just was
No,
interested
no, it's great.
when you mentioned that. 'Cause that's a very relevant thing that I've been trying to improve on. So,
Yeah. Yeah, read that article. That was a
well,
pretty aha moment for me. So maybe it'll help.
definitely, yeah. Thanks for the input. Yeah, appreciate it.
Cool. Well, that's it. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for the great questions.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you want to fork the project on GitHub, go for it. Or you want to, your list of suggestions was very helpful as like